In 1994, workers in Kellogg, Idaho, sealed something underground and told the public it was about pollution. They pointed to lead contamination from the Bunker Hill smelter as the justification. They cited environmental remediation. They called it a public health victory. And for 30 years, the public accepted that explanation without asking a single follow-up question. But here is what they never explained. You do not weld a mine shut to contain pollution. You pump the contaminated water out, you cap the surface, and you treat the discharge at the outflow. Welding the lower levels of one of the most structurally significant and geologically unusual mine complexes in North American history is not an environmental solution. It is a closure, a permanent one. And the question that the official story never answers is, what exactly was down there that required that kind of finality? The Bunker Hill mine sits in the Coeur d'Alene basin of northern Idaho, and if you only know it from the Superfund designation it received in 1983, you know the least interesting version of its story. The mine runs deep, far deeper than the official record acknowledges. The complex includes multiple levels extending far beneath the surface, some reaching over a mile underground, and the lower sections were accessed through a tunnel network that was, by all engineering accounts, extraordinarily well constructed. Not the rough-hewn passage walls you might expect from a late 19th century mining operation. Observers who worked in those levels described stonework that looked older than the mine itself. That detail tends to get ignored. It should not. The Tartarian framework, dismissed by mainstream historians before they have even examined the evidence, proposes something that becomes harder to deny the more you look at sites like Bunker Hill. The argument is not simply that a prior civilization existed. The argument is that certain sites in North America contain structural evidence of a civilization that predates the colonial period by centuries, possibly longer, and that those structures were integrated into later industrial operations precisely because they were already there. The mine did not create the tunnels, the mine found them. Independent researchers examining the geological survey records from Bunker Hill's early operations have noted consistent anomalies. The deeper levels showed precision-cut stone passages in areas where the mining company's own records do not account for any excavation work. The survey documentation from the 1880s and 1890s references chambers that appear to have been pre-existing before any recorded blasting. One internal company memo from 1902, which has circulated among researchers, though its provenance is contested. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Describes a lower gallery that the survey team believed had been sealed from the inside before their arrival. Sealed from the inside. That phrase should stop you. In a standard mining operation, the concern is always about things getting in. Water, gas, structural collapse. The directionality of concern is inward. A passage sealed from the inside means whoever or whatever was inside did the sealing. It means the closure happened from below, not above. And it means that when 20th century miners eventually broke through, they were opening something that had been deliberately shut, not discovering a natural formation. The Coeur d'Alene Basin itself has a geological character that alternative researchers have pointed to for decades. The silver and lead deposits that made the region an extraordinarily valuable site in a band of mineralization that is, by any standard metric, unusual in its regularity and density. Orthodox geology attributes this to hydrothermal processes over millions of years. But the pattern of the deposits, and critically, the pattern of the pre-existing tunnel structures that the mining companies incorporated into their operations, aligns more closely with what you would expect from systematic intentional extraction that had already been occurring for a very long time before any European arrived in the region. The indigenous oral traditions of the Coeur d'Alene people themselves include references to underground places that were considered sacred and forbidden. Not sacred in the sense of spiritually significant natural formations, sacred in the sense of places you did not go because something was there. The distinction matters. A mountain spring can be sacred. An underground location that is specifically described as inhabited, that carries warnings about what happens to those who descend into it, is a different category of cultural memory entirely. These traditions were documented by early Jesuit missionaries in the 1840s and largely filed away without interpretation. The missionaries understood them as pagan superstition. Researchers examining the same accounts now suggest they represent oral preservation of actual historical encounters with infrastructure that the tribal populations did not construct and did not fully understand. Now think about the timeline. Bunker Hill's mining operation began in earnest in the 1880s. The site was one of the most productive silver and lead complexes in American history, generating enormous wealth for the Guggenheim interests that eventually controlled it. Operations continued through most of the 20th century. When the Bunker Hill smelter was shut down in 1981 and the Superfund designation followed in 1983, the official narrative shifted entirely to contamination. The story became about lead poisoning in the surrounding community, about the environmental damage done by decades of smelting, about cleanup costs and public health remediation. All of that contamination was real. The children in Kellogg and Smelterville who showed elevated blood lead levels were real. The environmental damage was extensively documented. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. None of this is disputed. What is disputed in the communities of researchers who have spent years examining the Bunker Hill documentation is whether the contamination story was the reason for the closure or the justification for it. There is a meaningful difference between those two things. A reason causes an action. A justification explains an action that was going to happen regardless. The welding of the lower levels happened in a sequence that environmental remediation alone does not explain. Standard Superfund protocol for a mine site involves water treatment, surface capping, monitoring wells, and managed discharge. It does not involve permanently sealing subsurface access with welded steel barriers. The EPA's own remediation guidelines for comparable sites do not include that measure. Welding is not in the environmental remediation toolkit because it serves no environmental purpose. Water does not care about welded doors, and neither does gas, and neither does contaminated soil. The only thing a welded door stops is a person. So the question becomes, who were they trying to stop, and from reaching what? Researchers in the Tartarian investigation space have pointed to a pattern that repeats across North American sites from this era. The late 19th and early 20th century was a period of aggressive industrialization that required surveying and exploiting underground spaces across the continent. What the companies doing that surveying found in site after site was incorporated into the operations and then quietly buried in corporate documentation that was never made public. The Bunker Hill complex is unusual not because it contains anomalies, but because some of those anomalies leaked into accessible records. The 1902 internal memo is one example. There are others. A 1924 engineering report references a lower gallery designated as level 14 that does not appear on any of the publicly available mine maps. Level 14 is described in that report as requiring specialized ventilation equipment because of atmospheric conditions that the engineers could not fully account for. The report recommends limiting personnel access and suggests that further investigation of the gallery's origin and extent should be conducted by parties with relevant expertise, which is an extraordinarily vague recommendation for a document that is otherwise technically precise in every other respect. What expertise would be relevant exactly for investigating a pre-existing underground gallery in a silver mine in Idaho? The engineers clearly thought the question of origin was significant enough to mention. They clearly did not feel equipped to answer it themselves, and the follow-up investigation, if it happened, has left no public record. The Tartarian hypothesis, in its most rigorous form, does not require you to accept a single unified theory about who built these structures or when. What it requires is that you take the physical evidence seriously. The evidence at Bunker Hill includes precision stonework in lower galleries that predates the mining company's own excavation records. It includes the description of a passage sealed from the inside. It includes an entire underground level that does not appear on public maps. And it includes a final closure that went far beyond what environmental remediation required. When you look at comparable sites, a picture emerges. The Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky was incorporated into commercial tourism and later military use, with significant portions of its deepest sections quietly restricted from public access in the 1940s under wartime claims that were never revisited after the war ended. The Ozark Cave systems of Missouri contain chambers with evidence of occupation and modification that predates any recorded indigenous settlement of the region. The underground infrastructure beneath several American cities, from Chicago to Seattle, includes sections of passage that engineering historians cannot attribute to any documented construction project. These are not isolated curiosities. They form a pattern. And the pattern suggests that when Americans in the 19th and 20th centuries went underground to extract resources, they frequently found evidence that someone had been underground before them, much further before them than any accepted historical framework can accommodate. The official response to this pattern has been consistent across every instance. Attribute the anomalies to natural formation when possible. When that is not possible, restrict access. When restriction becomes complicated, close the site permanently and provide an alternative explanation significant enough to redirect public attention. At Bunker Hill, the lead contamination was significant enough. Nobody was going to argue against cleaning up a Superfund site that had poisoned children. And in the context of that legitimate public health concern, the welding of the lower levels passed without serious scrutiny. That is how it works. You do not suppress information by hiding it completely. You suppress it by ensuring that the explanation you want people to accept is more immediately compelling than the questions you want them to ignore. The contamination story was more compelling than the structural anomalies. The environmental remediation was more sympathetic than the engineering curiosity. And 30 years later, the lower levels of Bunker Hill remain welded shut, their contents inaccessible, their documentation locked in corporate archives that have never been subject to public records review because they belong to a private company and not to any government entity. Think about what that means for the possibility of future investigation. The EPA owns the Superfund designation. The remediation authority belongs to the government. But the mine itself, the physical structure, the underground access, the documentation of what was found during over a century of operation, all of that belongs to the Heckler Mining Company, which acquired the Bunker Hill assets and has no legal obligation to open its historical records to independent researchers. The welded doors cannot be opened without trespassing on private property. The internal documentation cannot be accessed without litigation that would cost more than most independent research operations could sustain. The public officials who oversaw the closure have retired or died. The engineers who did the welding worked for contractors who no longer exist. The trail does not go cold by accident. Trails go cold by design when the people managing them prefer cold trails. What remains accessible, and what the Tartarian research community continues to work with, is the public geological record, the missionary documentation, the indigenous oral traditions, the leaked corporate memos, and the engineering reports that made it into university archives before the systematic consolidation of Bunker Hill's documentation in private hands. Taken together, these sources tell a story that the official history does not. They describe a mine that discovered something it was not looking for, incorporated what it could into its operations, protected access to what it could not incorporate, and then, when the operation finally ended, made sure that what was below stayed below, permanently. The tailings from Bunker Hill stretch across 60 miles of the Coeur d'Alene watershed and represent one of the most significant heavy metal contamination events in American history. All of that is documented, all of it is real, and the cleanup is ongoing and necessary and important. But you can remediate tailings without welding a door. You can address water contamination without permanently sealing subsurface access. You can run a Superfund operation on a mine site without ensuring that no one will ever go back down to the levels where the anomalies were found. The question is not whether the contamination was real. It was. The question is, what else was real in those lower galleries in level 14, in the chamber that was sealed from the inside before the first European miner ever arrived in northern Idaho? The welded doors are not an environmental solution. They are an answer to a different question entirely. And until those doors open, or until the documentation that explains why they were closed becomes available to independent researchers, the real reason Bunker Hill's lower levels were sealed will remain exactly where the people who sealed them wanted it to remain, underground and out of reach.